Azov Cossack Host was a Cossack host that existed on the northern shore of the Sea of Azov between 1832 and 1862. The host was made up of several Cossack groups who were resettled there. The most numerous were the former Danubian Sich Cossacks, who previously returned to Russian patronage in 1828. The host was the only one in the Russian Empire whose primary task was Naval Coast Guard duties, participating extensively in the course of the Caucasus and Crimean Wars. Zadunare za Azovum. During the Russo-Turkish War, the Danubian Sich Cossacks, previously living in exile in Ottoman-controlled Danube Delta, were split in loyalty towards the Orthodox Russian Empire, who they left in 1775, and Islamic Ottoman Empire, which was about to start another war with Russia, led by the Koshataman Osip Gladky. Some of the Cossacks chose to defect to Russia, where they were pardoned by Nicholas I in 1828. The Tsar formed a special Zaporozhian host out of them, who took extensive part in the war. After Russia's victory, a separate newly created Danube Cossack host was deemed sufficient to safeguard the borders, and the ex-Zaporozhian presence in the Danube was deemed excessive. The Tsar, having personally befriended Gladky, suggested that his host moves to the Kuban to join the other ex-Zaporozhian Cossacks, the Black Sea Cossack hosts, who were actively involved against the Circassians in the course of the Caucasus War. In 1830, Gladky visited the Kuban, but rejected this idea of migrating there, citing the difficulties faced in such a long move for such a small host, and because such a persona would reject subordinating to the supreme authorities of the Black Sea Cossacks. The Tsar instead allowed the Cossacks to remain in Novorossiya, provided they find a suitable empty land. Gladky found the territory adjacent to the west of the Don Cossack host land on the northern coast of the Azov Sea between Berdyansk and Mariupol. Thus, in 1832, Gladky moved his host to Pryazovi, which numbered 2,336 Cossacks, and the Azov Cossack host was officially formed, with Gladky as its Nakazny Ataman. They were the only Cossack host that had a naval role and were tasked in guarding the Black Sea coasts of the Caucasus and Crimea. Because of their initial small size, the peasants of Novospassky Selo were also incorporated into the host. They were joined by numerous volunteers from the Chernigov Governorate, and in 1839 a group of 217 Nekrasov Cossacks were added to the host. Black Sea Coast Guard. The Azov host was instantly involved in the Caucasus War, and General Yermolov's aide, Velyaminov, suggested to press the Circassians from the southwestern slope of the Caucasus Ridge, which runs along the Black Sea from the Strait of Kerch all the way to Abkhazia. A defense line was proposed from Anapa all the way to Sukhum. The first marine landings by the Russian Black Sea Fleet took place in 1830 near Gagra, prior to the formation of the Azov host. After Gladky arrived in 1832, he immediately formed 10 commands numbering 20 Cossacks, and the specially made Barca boats were regularly carrying out pre-landing, reconnaissance, and offered fire support to the Russian Marines and sailors who were faced with conquering the very difficult landings. The Azov Cossacks also helped to intercept numerous English, French, and Turkish contraband supplies, and in 1835 off the coast of Novorossiysk they destroyed 2 schooners and later captured the English cargo ship Vixen, which carried a whole arsenal of illegal rifles. However, despite the success in 1839, Imam Shamal sent his Naib Magomed Amin, who instead of rallying the Circassians on the northern Kuban approach, unleashed them onto the Black Sea line in 1840. Outnumbered and after several Russian forts and garrisons were overrun, it was decided to abandon the Black Sea coast, and the Azov Cossacks proved their importance in evacuating the surviving Russian units. Despite the unsuccessful operation in building the line, the Russian evacuation did not affect the Azov Cossacks' role in patrolling the Black Sea coast. In 1845, the 26 commands were reorganized into two groups, the first one numbering 147 Cossacks and 7 Starshinas patrolling the coast from Anapa, where they were based, to Navaginsk fort, and the southern group numbering 164 Cossacks with 20 officers from Svertogo Dukat to Svertogo Nikola. During the following years, as quoted by General M. Rayevsky, the Azov Cossacks recommended themselves as a potent force and stroke fear to the captains of contraband ships and Circassian galleys. The success of the Azov Cossacks led to a plan being drawn in 1843 to once again resettle them to the whole Black Sea coast from Mingrelier to the mouth of the Kuban River. This, however, was never realized. Crimean War. After the events of 1848, it became clear that Russia was en route to another major conflict between Ottoman Empire and her new allies, Britain and France. The Azov Cossack Host's first job was to sabotage the remaining Russian strongholds on the Caucasus coast, which they themselves have built. After the British and French navies penetrated the Strait of Kerch and entered the Sea of Azov, they planned to navigate up the Don River to force the Russian armies en route to reinforce Crimea to divert the attention. The Azov host was tasked with preventing the enemy from reaching the Don, a task which they accomplished. However, in addition to guarding the Don and the Black Sea duties in Novorossiysk, the Azov Cossacks were constantly involved in guarding their own home, and Gladky formed 3 irregular units, a naval battalion numbering 722 Cossacks, an infantry battalion with 400 more, and a cavalry sotnya which had further 104 Cossacks. However, the weakly defended Strait of Kerch meant that in May 1855 a squadron of 57 English and French ships easily overpowered the Russian garrison there and entered the Azov basin. Afterwards the enemy approached Berdyansk and bombarded the city from the sea. Similar attacks were experienced by Petrovskaya Stanitsa, Mariupol and numerous other locations on the coast of the northern Azov. Yet any attempts to land troops on the shores turned out to be complete failures. When attempting to land at the headquarters of the Azov host Petrovsky Posad, the Anglo-French troops demanded the Cossacks surrender and sent their landing party of 100 boats. None were to reach the shores. Afterwards, the survivors of the failed landing returned to the ships. The squadron tried to land near Taganrog, but a similar fate awaited them from the hands of the Don Cossacks. After the end of the war in 1856, all of the units, save the ones which resumed the previous patrolling of the Caucasus coast, were disbanded. The Azov host was awarded with the highest award that a Russian military unit could earn, the Banner of St. George, whose inscription read, "For exceptional bravery and excellent service during the war against the French, English and Turks in 1853 to 1858, the end of the Azov host." After the Crimean War, Gladky, attaining rank of General Colonel, retired and moved to Alexandrovsk, where he died in 1866. However, the northern shore of the Azov during the 30 years of the Cossack presence became a prosperous region, where the Cossacks numbering 10,000 men were involved in fishery, farming and trade. In 1860, however, the Caucasus War approached its decisive finale, and Russian General Nikolai Yevdokimov initiated several reforms of the Caucasus hosts. forming the Kuban and Terek Cossack hosts out of the previous Black Sea Caucasus Line hosts. The Circassian front, particularly the Western Caucasus, after decades of stationary action, began a process of capturing Circassian land and moving the peaceful Circassians from mountains to the ravines, and expelling those hostile to Ottoman Empire. To help settle the empty mountainous land, Yevdokimov suggested to Emperor Alexander II to bring the Azov Cossacks, whose military role by now was expiring, as the Imperial Russian Navy in the Black Sea has made provisions for taking over the Coast Guard roles. Originally, Yevdokimov proposed to move 800 Cossack and aid officer families to the Western Caucasus with financial compensation and free transport promised to them. After freeing those who lacked elder sons, adolescent orphans and those older than 45 or were sick to travel, it was planned to use the draw method of selection. However, no draw was required. All Cossacks who were descendants of the Danubian Sich, the Nekrosovites, as well as the Cossacks of the Starodubskaya Stanitsa agreed to move to the Kuban, whilst the dwellers of the Novospasskaya and Petrovskaya Stanitsas, who were local peasants and traders that were enlisted into Cossackdom in 1832, chose to stay. All in all 1093 families, nearly half of the Azov host, left the Azov in 1862, and were settled in the stanitsas of the Abansk and Adugamsk regiments of the Kuban Cossack host. They participated in the finale of the Caucasus War, which ended 2 years later in 1864. Afterwards, the ex-Azov Cossacks became fully integrated into the Kuban host, shared the history since. To this day, the descendants live in the mountainous stanitsas of modern Krasnodar and Adygea in Russia. The remaining Azov region was passed to the Yekaterinoslav Governorate and afterwards to the Ukrainian SSR, where the former Petrovskaya Stanitsa was renamed to Volodarsky in 1924. At present, there are attempts to spread the knowledge of the Cossack heritage that the region has.